Good afternoon. Welcome to your number one business TV show and updates. I am your host, Kyla de Guzman, taking you through this quick session, The Business. So here are the foreign currencies update for today. And speaking of foreign exchange currencies, in this quick episode, we will talk about the foreign exchange market and how it affects companies that engage internationally. And just like the previous episodes, we will also have a professional speaker today for us to be able to understand this topic. Like many enterprises in the global economy, the earnings and revenues of the international businesses are impacted by changes in the relative value of currencies over time. So accordingly, it's very important for managers to understand how the foreign exchange market works and what the impact of changes in the currency exchange rates might be for the enterprise and its strategy. This episode has two main objectives. First is to explain how the foreign exchange market works, and second is to examine the forces that determine exchange rates and to discuss the degree to which it is possible to predict future exchange rates movements. The foreign exchange market is a market for converting the currency of one country into that of another country. An exchange rate is simply the rate at which one currency is converted into another. Without the foreign exchange market, international trade and international investment on the scale that we see today would be impossible. Companies would have to resort to barter. So what are the main functions of the foreign exchange market? First is to convert the currency of one country to the currency of another. And second, to provide some insurance against foreign exchange risk or the adverse consequences of unpredictable changes in exchange rates. So the first function of foreign exchange market is currency conversion. Each country has a currency in which the prices of goods and services are quoted. In the United States, it is the dollar. In Great Britain, it is the pound. In France, Germany, and other 17 members of the Eurozone, it is the euro. And in the Philippines, it is the Philippine peso. So in general, within the borders of a particular country, one must use the national currency. So for instance, an American tourist cannot walk into a store in Cebu, Philippines and use the US dollars to buy a bottle of Scotch whiskey. Dollars are not recognized as legal tender in the Philippines, so the tourist must use peso currency. Fortunately, the tourist can go to a bank and exchange her dollars for pesos. Then she can buy the whiskey. Tourists are minor participants in the foreign exchange markets, while the companies engaged in international trade and investment are the major ones. International businesses have four main uses of foreign exchange markets. So first, the payments a company receives for its exports, the income it receives from foreign investments, or the income it receives from licensing agreements with foreign firms may be in a foreign currencies. So to use those funds in its home country, the company must convert them to its home country's currencies. So for instance, Toyota sells its cars in the United States for dollars. It must convert the US dollars it receives into Japanese yen to use them in Japan. Second, the international businesses use foreign exchange markets when they must pay a foreign company for its products or services in its country's currency. So for example, Dell buys many of the components for its computers from Malaysian firms. The Malaysian companies must be paid in Malaysian currency, the ringgit, so Dell must convert money from dollars into ringgit to pay them. So third, international businesses also use foreign exchange markets when they have spare cash that they wish to invest for short terms in money markets. And fourth is the currency speculation. Currency speculation typically involves the short-term movement of funds from one currency to another in the hopes of profiting from shifts in exchange rates. So let us consider a US company with $10 million to invest for 3 months. Suppose the company suspects that the US dollar is overvalued against the Philippine peso, and that is the company expects the value of the dollar to depreciate or fall against that of the peso. So imagine the current dollars or peso exchange rate is $1 is equals to 50 pesos. The company exchanges its $10 million into peso receiving 500 million pesos. So over the next 3 months, the value of the dollar depreciates against the peso until $1 is equal to 40 pesos per day. So now the company exchanges its 500 million pesos back into dollars and finds that it has $12.5 billion. The company has made $2.5 billion profit on currency speculation in 3 months on an initial investment of $10 million. But in general, companies should beware for speculation by definition is a very risky business. And for the next foreign exchange market, which is the foreign exchange risk, with the help of our special guest, we will be discussing how the market performs this function. But first, we must distinguish spot exchange rates, forward exchange rates, and currency swaps. Let's have a round of applause to the representatives of the Multinational Investment Association, Ms. Karen Erica Inlong. Welcome to the BizTalk, Ms. Karen.
The pleasure is mine, Ms. Kayla. Thank you for having me here.
Now, Ms. Karen, can you please tell us how can we determine the spot exchange rates, forward exchange rates, and the currency swaps?
A second function of the foreign exchange market is to provide insurance against foreign exchange risks, which is the possibility that unpredicted changes in future exchange rates will have adverse consequences for the firm. When a firm insures itself against foreign exchange risks, it is engaging in hedging. Furthermore to that, insuring against foreign exchange risks start in first the spot exchange rate. When two parties agree to exchange currency and execute the deal immediately, the transaction is referred to as a spot exchange. Exchanges rates governing such on-the-spot rates are referred to as spot exchanges rates. The spot exchange rate is the rate at which a foreign exchange dealer converts one currency into another currency on a particular day. Thus, when a U.S. tourist in Cebu goes to a bank to convert her dollar into peso, the exchange rate in the spot rate for that day. The second one is forward exchange rate. A forward exchange rates occur when two parties agree to exchange currency and execute the deal at some specific date in the future. Exchange rate governing such future transactions are referred to as foreign exchange rates. For most major currencies, forward exchange rates for several years into the future. In this example, the spot exchange rate today is $1 is equal to 50 pesos, and the 30-day forward rate become $1 is equal to 45 pesos deeper. Such differences are normal. They reflect the expectation of the foreign exchange market about future currency movements. The third one is currency swap. It is a simultaneous purchase and sale of given amount of foreign for two different value dates. Swap are transacted between international business and their banks, between banks, and between government when it is desirable to move out of one currency into another for a limited period without incurring foreign exchange risks. A common reason to employ a currency swap is to secure cheaper debt. For example, Philippines Company A borrow $120 million from U.S. Company B. Concurrently, Philippines Company A lends $1 million to U.S. Company B. The exchange is based on $1.2 spot rate index to the London Interbank Offered Rate. The deal allows for borrowing at the most favorable rate. And after that, to understand how prices are related to exchange rate movement, we need to discuss an economic proposition as the law of one price. Then we will discuss the theory of purchasing power parity or PPP, which links changes in the exchange rate between two countries' currencies and to changes in the country's price level. The first one is the law of one price. It states that in competitive market, free of transportation costs and barriers to trade such as tariffs, identical products sold in different countries must sell for the same price when their price is expressed in terms of the same currency. For example, if the exchange rate between the Philippine peso and the dollar is 50 pesos is equal to $1, assured that retails for $2 in New York should sell for 100 pesos in Manila. The The second one is purchasing power parity. It is the measurement of price in different countries that uses prices of specific good to compare the absolute purchasing power of countries' currencies. Purchasing power parity. If the law of one price were true of all goods and services, the purchasing power parity exchange rate could be found from any individual set of prices by comparing the prices of identical product in different currencies. It would be possible to determine the real or PPP exchange rate that would exist if markets were efficient. Thus, if a basket of goods costs $200 in United States and 10,000 in Philippine pesos, PPP theory predicts that the dollar-peso exchange rate should be $200 over 10,000 pesos or $0.2 per Philippine peso is that $1 is equal to 50 pesos. The third one is money supply and price inflation. When the growth in a country's money supply is faster than the growth in its output, price inflation is fueled. The PPP theory tells us that a country with high inflation rate will see depreciation in its currency exchange rate. In one of the theory's historical example, in the mid-1980s, Bolivia experienced hyperinflation, an explosive and seemingly uncontrollable price inflation in which money loses value very rapidly. The third one is empirical test of PPP theory. PPP theory predicts that exchange rates are determined by relative prices and that changes in relative prices will result in a change in exchange rates. A country in which price inflation is running wild should expect to see its currency depreciates against that of countries with lower inflation rates. There are several good examples of the connection between a country's price inflation and exchange rate position. However, extensive empirical testing of PPP theory has yielded mixed results. While PPP theory seems to yield relatively accurate predictions in the long run, it does not appear to be a strong predictor of short-run movement and exchange rate covering time spans of 5 years or less. Interest rates and exchange rates. Economic theory tells us interest rates reflect expectation about likely future inflation rates. In countries where inflation is expected to be high, interest rates also will be high because investors want compensation for the decline in the value of their money. The relationship was first formalized by economist Irving Fisher and is referred to as the Fisher effect. The Fisher effect states that a country's nominal interest rate is the sum of the required real rate of interest and the expected rate of inflation over the period for which the funds are to be lent. The last one is investor psychology and bandwagon effects. Empirical evidence suggests that neither PPP theory nor the international Fisher effect is particularly good at explaining short-term movements in exchange rate. One reason may be the impact of investor psychology on short-run exchange rate movements. Evidence has revealed that various psychological factors play an important role in determining the expectation of market traders as to likely future exchange rate. In turn, expectations have tendency to become self-fulfilling prophecies. Okay, that's it. To summarize everything, relative monetary growth, relative inflation rate, and nominal interest rate differentials are all moderately good predictors of long-run changes in exchange rate. They are poor predictors of short-run changes in exchange rates. However, perhaps because of the impact of psychological factors, investor expectation and bandwagon effects on short-term currency movement, this information is useful for an international business. Insofar as the long-term profitability of foreign investment, export opportunities, and the price competitiveness of foreign imports are all influenced by long-term movement exchange rates. International businesses would be advised to pay attention to countries' differing monetary growth, inflation, and interest rates. International businesses that engage in foreign exchange transactions on a day-to-day basis could benefit by knowing some predictors of short-term foreign exchange rate movements. Unfortunately, short-term exchange rate movements are difficult to predict.
Thank you, Ms. Karen, for giving us your time to explain the factors that influence the changes in exchange rates movement.
It's my pleasure to be invited here, and I hope everyone of you learns something.
For more detailed explanation about foreign exchange market, catch us on Channel 13 every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. Again, it's Skyla de Guzman and you are watching The Biz Talks, bringing you the eye on the news updates and lessons about the business world.
This program is rated PG. It contains themes and scenes which may not be suitable for very young audiences. Parental guidance is advised.
Everyone, so for today's news, we're going to talk about the International Monetary System. But before that, let's talk first about what is the purpose of money in the economy. Money is defined as a unit of account that serves as a medium of exchange and transactions. Individuals and organizations would have a hard time acquiring or exchanging what they need, want, or make if they didn't have money. Money acts as a universal medium of exchange. Now, let's move on with what is International Monetary System or IMS. The International Monetary System, or IMS, is a well-designed system that governs currency valuations and transfer between countries. It is a well-managed system that oversees cross-border payments, exchange rates, and capital movement. The International Monetary System has many participants, including the multinational corporations, investors, financial constitutions, and so on. The International Monetary System's major goal now is to promote the global fast development while maintaining stable pricing levels. Previously, the system's scope was limited to exchange rate. Now, the system has expanded to include financial stability. Or in short, each country has its own currency as money, and the International Monetary System governs the rules of valuing and exchanging these currencies. Before properly appreciating the current monetary system, it's helpful to look back on time and observe how money and the system that govern it use evolved. The following phases can be used to categorize the major stages of the International Monetary System evolution. First is the gold standard. The first phase of the International Monetary System was the classic gold standard from 1875 to 1914. In the initial years of the gold standard, only a few countries adopted the standard. Later on, almost all countries accepted it. The gold standard created a fixed exchange rate system. So before we proceed, let me explain to you what is exchange rate and exchange rate system. Exchange rates can be understood as the price of one currency in terms of another currency. However, just like for the goods and services, we must take into account what determines that price since the government can influence it and even fix it. So next, the exchange rate regime. It is a system that a country's monetary authority, generally the central bank, adopts to establish the exchange rates of its own currency against other currency. For the exchange rate system, there is a flexible exchange rates. In other words, they are prices of foreign exchange determined by the market that can rapidly change due to supply and demand and are not pegged nor controlled by the central banks. The next, fixed exchange rate, also referred to as peg exchange rate. The opposite of flexible exchange rate, wherein central banks intervene in the market with purchases and sales of foreign and domestic currency in order to keep the exchange rate within the limits. Advantage of the gold standard. Number 1, gold standard also made all countries of the world abide by the strict monetary policy. The first advantage is that countries were forced to observe strict monetary policies. They could not just print money to combat economic downturns. Therefore, the volume of paper currency could not exceed the gold reserve. Second one, the gold standard created a stable exchange rate system that was conducive to international trade. The gold standard dramatically reduced the risk in exchange rate because it established fixed exchange rate between currencies. This made it easier for global companies to manage costs and pricing. Third, the balance of payment or BOP. This standard was helpful in correcting trade imbalances in the country. Why the classic gold standard collapsed? After the end of the World War I, the classic gold standard collapsed. During World War, many countries printed more money in order to finance their military requirements. As a result of this, the money in circulation exceeded the gold reserve of the country, and so thus country have to give up on classic gold standard. Next, evolution, the interwar period. The period between World War I and World War II is known as the interwar period. This was the next episode of the International Monetary System from 1915 to 1944. Countries began to depreciate their currencies to be able to export more. It was a period of floating exchange rate and competitive devaluation. When we say floating exchange rate, it is a regime where the currency price of a nation is set by the forex market based on supply and demand relative to other currencies. This is a contrast to a fixed exchange rate, in which the government entirely or predominantly determines the rate. Third evolution, the Bretton Woods system. In the early 1940s, United States and the United Kingdom began discussions to rebuild the world economy after the destructions of two world wars. Their goal was to create a fixed exchange rate system without the gold standard. The new international monetary system was established in 1944 in a conference organized by the United Nations in a town named Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA. The conference is officially known as the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. It was attended by the 44 countries. The Bretton Woods created a dollar-based fixed exchange rate system. In the Bretton Woods system, only the US fixed the value of its currency to gold. The initial peg was $35 is equals to 1 ounce of gold. This system advocated the adoption of the exchange rate standard that included both gold and foreign exchange. Under this system, each country established a par value in relation to the US dollar, which was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Downfall of the Bretton Woods system. Post-World War situation, the supply of US dollars suddenly increased in the world economy. As a result, many countries started questioning the quantum of gold reserves of the US government with the supply of the US dollar. By 1973, many countries started losing confidence in the US dollar and started searching for some other reliable. Despite a fixed exchange rate based on the US dollar and more national flexibility, the Bretton Woods Agreement ran into challenges in the early 1970s. The US trade balance had turned into a deficit as Americans were importing more than they were exporting. Jamaica Agreement. In 1976, countries met to formalize a floating exchange rate system as the new international monetary system. The Jamaica Agreement established a managed float system of exchange rates in which currencies float against one another with governments intervening only to stabilize their currencies at set target exchange rates. This is a contrast to a completely free floating exchange rate system, which has no government intervention. Currencies float freely against one another. When we say floating exchange rate system, it means that the exchange rate of a currency is determined by the market forces of demand and supply. India has managed floating exchange rate system. The exchange rate is determined by market forces. The international financial architecture was regulated by the G5 countries. This G5 group has currently turned into G20 with a group of 20 countries managing the exchange rate on managed float system.
And now, let's proceed to the history of the International Monetary Fund. The architects of the Bretton Woods Agreement, John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, envisioned an institution that would oversee the international monetary system, exchange rates, and international payments to enable countries and their citizens to buy goods and services from each other. They expected that this new global entity would ensure exchange rate stability and encourage its member countries to eliminate the exchange restrictions that hindered trade. Officially, the IMF came into existence in December 1945 with 29 member countries. These bits who were at Bretton Woods refused to join the IMF. In 1947, the institution's first formal year of operations, the French became the first nation to borrow from the IMF. Over the next 30 years, more countries joined the IMF, including some African countries in the 1960s. The Soviet bloc nations remained the exception and were not part of the IMF until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. The IMF experienced another large increase in members in the 1990s with the addition of Russia. Russia was also placed on the IMF's executive community. Today, 187 countries are members of the IMF. 24 of those countries or groups of countries are represented on the executive board. And now, the purpose of the International Monetary Funds is to promote international monetary cooperation through a permanent institution which provides the machinery for consultation and collaboration on international monetary problems. Second, to facilitate the expansion and balanced growth of international trade and to contribute thereby to the promotion and maintenance of high levels of employment and real income and to the development of the productive resources of all members as primary objectives of economic policy. Third is to promote exchange stability, to maintain orderly exchange arrangements among members, and to avoid competitive exchange depreciation. For the fourth is to assist in the establishment of a multilateral system of payments in respect of current transactions between members and in the elimination of foreign exchange restrictions which hamper the growth of world trade. Fifth is to give confidence to members by making the general resources of the fund temporarily available to them under adequate safeguards, thus providing them with opportunity to correct maladjustments in their balance of payments without resorting to measures destructive of national or international prosperity. Special drawing rights. Special drawing right is not a currency, but some refer to it as a form of International Monetary Fund currency. It does not constitute a claim on the International Monetary Fund, which only serves to provide a mechanism for buying, selling, and exchanging SDRs. Countries are allocated SDRs, which are included in the member countries' reserves. Criticism and challenging areas for the International Monetary Funds. Condition for loans. The International Monetary Funds makes the loan given to countries conditional on the implementation of certain economic policies, which typically include the following: reducing government borrowing, higher interest rates to stabilize the currency, allowing failing firms to go bankrupt, and structural adjustment. Next is the exchange rate reforms. When the International Monetary Funds intervened in Kenya in 1990s, they made the central bank remove controls over flows of capital. The consensus was that this decision made it easier for corrupt politicians to transfer money out of the economy, known as the Goldman scandal. Next, devaluations. In the initial stages, the International Monetary Funds has been criticized for allowing inflationary devaluations. Criticisms of International Monetary Funds economics help. Pre-market criticism of the International Monetary Funds. Believers in free markets argue that it's better to let capital markets operate without attempts at intervention. They argue attempts to influence exchange rates only make things worse. It is better to allow currencies to reach their market level. Lack of transparency and involvement. The International Monetary Fund has been criticized for imposing policy with little or no consultation with affected countries. Supporting military dictatorships. The International Monetary Fund has been criticized over the decades for supporting military dictatorships. Opportunities and future outlook for international monetary funds. 1. Flexibility and speed. In March 2009, the International Monetary Fund created the Flexible Credit Line or FCL, which is a fast disbursing loan facility with low conditionality aimed at reassuring investors by injecting liquidity. Traditionally, International Monetary Fund loan program requires the imposition of austerity measures such as raising interest rates that can reduce foreign investment. Second is the cheerleading. The fund is positioning itself to be less of an adversary and more of a cheerleader to member countries. For some countries that need loans more for reassurance than reform, these changes to the fund toolkit are welcome. Third is the adaptability. Instead of providing the same medicine to all countries, regardless of their particular problems, the new loan facilities are intended to aid reform-minded governments by providing short-term resources to reassure investors. In these manners, may help politicians in developing countries manage the downside cost of integration. And last, the transparency. The International Monetary Fund has made efforts to improve its own transparencies and continues to encourage its member countries to do so. Supporters note that this creates a barrier to any one or more countries that have more geopolitical influence in the organization. In reality, the major economics continue to exert influence on policy and implementation. The World Bank and the World Bank Group. The World Bank came into existence in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. Its formal name is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, which clearly states its primary purpose of financing economic development. The World Bank has one central purpose: to promote economic and social progress in developing countries by helping raising productivity so that their people may live a better and fuller life. Today, the World Bank consists of two main bodies: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, and the International Development Association, or IDA. Established in 1960, the World Bank is part of the broader World Bank Group, which consists of 5 interrelated institutions: the IBRD, the IDA, the International Finance Corporation, or IFC, which was established in 1956, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, or MIGA, which was established in 1988, and the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, or ICSID, which was established in 1966. These additional members of the World Bank Group have specific purposes as well. The IDA typically provides interest-free loans to countries with sovereign guarantees. The IPC provides loan equity, risk management tools, and structured finance. Its goals is to facilitate sustainable development by improving investments in the private sector. The MIGA focuses on improving the foreign direct investment of developing countries. The ICSID provides a means for a dispute resolution between governments and private investors with the end goal of enhancing the flow of capital.
Thank you, Ms. Kina. For the next news, we have what are the World Bank's current role and major challenges and opportunities. Like the IMF, the World Bank has both its critics and its supporters. The World Bank tries to address some of the world's most pressing problems through economic and development-related aid. The first is even in 2010, over 3 billion people live on less than $2.50 a day. The second is at the start of 21st century, almost a billion people couldn't read a book or sign their names. The third is less than 1% of what the world spend each year on weapons would have put every child into school by the year of 2000, but it didn't happen. And lastly, fragile states such as Afghanistan, Rwanda, and Sri Lanka face severe development challenges such as weak institutional capacity, poor governance, political instability, and often ongoing violence, or the legacy of past conflicts. According to the Encyclopedia of the New American Nation and the New York Times, the World Bank is criticized primarily for the following reasons. The first is administrative incompetence. Critics assert that the World Bank has shifted from being a lender of last resort to an internal welfare organization. Also incriminating is that the bank lacks lending standards have led to a rapidly deteriorating loan portfolio. Next is rewarding or supporting inefficient or corrupt countries. The World Bank's lending policies often reward microeconomics, inefficient in the underdeveloped world. This allows inefficient nations to avoid the types of fundamental reform that would in the long run to end poverty. Third, focusing on large projects rather than initiatives. Critics claim that the World Bank loans give preference to large infrastructure projects such as buildings, dams, electric plants that would benefit the poor. The project often destroy the local environment including forests, rivers, and fisheries. Fourth is negative influence theory and practices. Critics worry that because of World Bank and IMF are regarded as experts in financial regulations and economic development, their views and prescriptions may undermine or eliminate alternative perspectives and development. The next is dominance of G7 countries. The industrial countries dominate the World Bank and IMF governance structures. Decisions are typically made and policies implemented by these leading countries, the G7, because they are the largest donors. Some suggest without sufficient consultation with poor and developing countries. For the next news, opportunities and future outlook for the World Bank. The World Bank current focus is on helping countries achieve the Millennium Development Goals, which were established in 2000 and at the Millennium Summit. The MDGs include reducing extreme poverty, child mortality rates, fighting disease epidemics such as AIDS, and developing a global partnership for development. The World Bank is focused on the following four key issues. The first is increasing transparency. In response to the criticism over the decades, the World Bank has made progress. More of the World Bank's decision-making and country assessment are available publicly. The World Bank has continued to work with countries to combat corruption and the country and bank levels. The second is expanding social issues in the fight of poverty. In 2001, the World Bank began to incorporate gender issues into its policy. 2 years later, the World Bank announced that it was starting to evaluate its project for their effect on women and girls, noting that poverty experienced differently by men and women. And a full understanding of the gender dimension of poverty can significantly change the definition of prior policy and program intervention. The third is improvements in countries' competitiveness and increasing exports. The World Bank's policies and role as a donor have helped improve the ability of sub-African countries to secure more of global revenues for basic commodities. In Rwanda, for example, reforms transformed the country's coffee industry and increased exports. The World Bank has also helped African financial companies develop. The fourth is improving efficient and diverse industries and leveraging the private sector. In Afghanistan, for example, small dams are built and maintained by the local themselves to support the small industries, processing local produce. The World Bank has worked closely with business in the private sector to develop local infrastructure, including power, transportation, telecommunication, healthcare, and education. The World Bank continues to play an integral role in helping countries reduce poverty and improving the well-being of their citizens. The World Bank funding provides resources to countries to utilize their service of global companies to accomplish their objectives. Our last news, understanding how international monetary policy, the IMF, and the World Bank impact business practices. So, how business is impacted by the current monetary environment, the IMF, and the World Bank. All businesses seek to operate in a stable and predictable environment. The global monetary system provides a predictable mechanism for companies to exchange currencies. Global firms monitor the policies of the G20 and other economic organizations so that they can use their leverage to protect their markets and businesses. The Bretton Woods institution that have intensive global influence and occasionally use it to nudge countries to reduce trade barrier. One recent example involves the International Monetary Fund and China. The IMF has warned that China trade surplus will increase unless the government increase domestic consumption. China exports machine has been fueled in large part by the low value of the renminbi. Letting in trade with reduced or no government intervention would likely reduce the country's massive export. Supporting domestic consumption instead will reduce China's reliance on the external demand. While the IMF can only issue a report, action is completely at the discretion of the country's government. However, for global businesses, this can be encouraged in several ways. First, companies are eager to enter the Chinese market may find it easier or the climate more welcoming. Second, the renminbi increased in value. The Chinese can purchase more goods and services from overseas firms. If Chinese currency increase in value, Chinese export will become more expensive, allowing other companies to compete more effectively against Chinese firms. These are just a couple of simple scenarios, but they illustrate the range of issues and concerns that China may have with the IMF report and the opportunities that may arise for the global businesses. However, already in early 2011, China announced its intention to let the renminbi begin to trade more freely.
Thank you, Ms. Paselo. Good afternoon. My name is Kobe Perez Lulu, reporting on the Global Monetary System, Global Capital Market. Global capital market is a place where savings meets investment. The functions of a generic capital market is to bring together those who want to invest and borrow money. Those who want to invest money includes corporations with surplus cash, individuals, and non-bank financial institutions. On the other hand, those who want to borrow money includes individuals, companies, and governments. Between these two groups are the market makers. Market makers are the financial service companies that connect investors and borrowers, both directly and indirectly. They include commercial banks and investment banks. Next, let's move on to the attractions of the global capital market. A global capital market benefits both borrowers and investors. It benefits borrowers by increasing the supply of funds available for borrowing. and by lowering the cost of capital. It benefits investors by providing a wider range of investment opportunities, thereby allowing them to build portfolios of international investments that diversify their risks. Now, let's talk about the growth of the global capital market. According to the data from the Bank of International Settlements, the global capital market is growing at a rapid pace. Stocks, bonds, and bank loans currently totaled over $300 trillion, more than 3 times the size of the world economy. The two factors driving this growth are the advances in information technology and the regulations of the government. Lastly, let's talk about the global capital market risks. Some analysts are more concerned that due to the regulation and reduced controls on cross-border capital flows, individual nations are becoming more and more vulnerable to speculative capital flows. They see this as having a destabilizing effect on national economies. For example, according to Harvard economist Martin Feldstein, most of the capitals that moves internationally is pursuing temporary gains, and it shifts in and out of countries as quickly as conditions change. That's all for my report. Now let's hear from reporter Joanne Zamora. Miss Joanne.
Good day, thank you, Miss Lulu. Today is October 19, 2021. My name is Joanne Zamora, and you are watching the Global Monetary System to Global Capital Market. Euro currency market is a money market for a currency outside of the country where it is legal tender. And Euro currency market is utilized by the multinational corporations, mutual funds, and hedge funds. The Euro currency market was born in the middle 1915 with Eastern European holding Soviet Union were offered to deposit their holding or dollars in the United States. Test by this by the U.S. government, where little U.S. residents claim business losses resulting from communities take over Eastern Europe. Euro currency market received a major boost in 1960s when the British funds to finance, and also the Euro currency market received another push in the 1960s when the U.S. enacted regulation that discouraged U.S. banks from lending to non-U.S. residents. Attraction of the Euro currency market. The main factor that makes the Euro currency market attractive both depositors and borrowers, it is lack of government regulation. This allows banks to offer higher interest rates on Euro currency deposits than deposits made in the home currency. Drawbacks of the Euro currency market. The Euro currency market has two drawbacks. First, when depositors use in a regulated banking system, they know that the profitability of the bank failure that would cause them to lose their deposit is very low. Second, borrowing found internationally can expose a company to foreign exchange risk. For example, consider a U.S. company that uses a Euro currency market to borrow funds because it can pay a lower interest the dollar.